Hi, welcome to today's presentation of Basic Rights in Special Education. My name is Deb Belanger, and I'm one of the managers at Rhode Island Parent Information Network. The Rhode Island Parent Information Network is a nonprofit organization that serves as a state-designated parent center in Rhode Island. We work with families, individuals, and professionals, helping them achieve their educational and health goals. The program that I'm directly involved with educates and supports families, students, and professionals as they navigate educational systems, specifically for children with disabilities. The following workshop you're about to see is our most requested training. Basic Rights in Special Education specifically focuses on Rhode Island's special education system and regulations. We hope you enjoy this presentation, and if you have further questions or need additional information, please contact our Resource Center at 401-270-0101. So let's get started. As I said, today's presentation is Basic Rights in Special Education, and we are going to have a pretty hefty agenda that starts with the referral process, evaluation, eligibility. We're going to move into the IEP a little bit, not so much the form itself, but just a little bit about that process, ending with procedural safeguards, and we're also going to talk about dispute resolution, but more information, more details will show up in the rest of the workshop. So first I wanted to start just a little bit with IDEA, and for those of you who don't know what IDEA is, it's the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It was originally enacted in 1975, and it's a federal law that governs special education. It is an entitlement law, which means that the government agrees to give states funding if they meet the requirements of that law. When IDEA was reauthorized in 2004, this workshop is going to actually reflect those changes. Rhode Island law is what we're going to be talking about specifically today. A little bit more information. The IDEA was reauthorized to align with what was once called the No Child Left Behind Act, which really focuses on accountability. And that became a really important piece of the new regulations. There was a time when children, my son is 28 years old, and when he was first diagnosed and went into the school system, people weren't making sure that he was learning how to read, write, learning math. There was no data collection for that. So a lot of times those kids were left out of those programs. Now with those changes, it really has assured that all of our children are being accounted for and that there's high levels of standards that they are hopefully able to reach. So let's start with the very beginning of this process, the referral process. And what does someone do if you feel your child may need special education supports or they have a disability? So anyone can request or put in a referral for a child to be tested to find out if, yes, they do have an underlying disability. Every district, though, has a different process. So in Rhode Island, we have over 30 school districts, and it's important for that parent to have conversations within their school to find out where exactly they need to make that referral. The most important part of this, you're going to hear me say this a lot throughout the presentation, especially when we talk about timelines, is putting these actions in writing. So at the very beginning of this process, it's going to be very important for a parent to put a letter in writing requesting that evaluation. And here's an example why. We got a call, I remember a couple years back in the fall, from a parent who called our resource center and said, you know, I've been telling the school, my child's failing and I want them to test her for special education. And so we asked her the question, so how long has this been going on? And the mom said, well, I started talking to them last March. And our question was, did you put anything in writing? And she said, well, no. And so even though she's been talking about it, the school really doesn't have that level of responsibility to actually take an action and start that process. So we had to really start her at that point from square one, getting that letter written. And unfortunately, 5-6 months had passed. So it really becomes a very important part, and parents should be very, very aware of that. When we start with that first letter, that paperwork, we start the timeline process, which really is the basis for a lot of the protections that parents have under the special education. So when we start that process, when a family writes that letter, the school has 10 days at that point to kind of sit down and talk about that. What are we going to do with this? It doesn't mean we automatically get an evaluation. A team of people need to get together, and that team includes professionals and families. Parents need to be at that table. Again, 10, 15 years ago, schools only needed to invite parents to the table, but now, by law, by these new regulations, schools are required to make sure that that parent voice is at that table. The next piece that happens is if there are evaluations that are needed, at that point, there's another piece that parents now, they need to sign parental consent. So the school can't go and start evaluating a student without that parent writing, making sure that they have signed and that they understand what they're signing before they can actually go and do any of that, any of those evaluations. Now this whole process, which we're going to talk about more, could take anywhere from 2.5 to 3 months before that child could be getting special education services. So it is really important to stay ahead of the timelines. And as we say to parents, you know, we want them to understand this because we want them to not to go into kind of a wait and see and then wait for something to break. And now, you know, we go in and say, hey, you know, you were supposed to do this in such and such a time. We want parents to go in, have that meeting, talk about those evaluations, sign consent, and maybe have that parent sign up, follow up with a note that says, thank you for the meeting. I understand that we are now supposed to get together again, or this evaluation is going to take place in another 10 days. So it helps parents to really be part of the process as opposed to the ones kind of being the police, you know, when it breaks, then when they're jumping in. So it really is important to understand how this rolls out. So when must those evaluations begin? Well, they need to start no later than 10 days after parental consent. So once you've signed off on that you're okay, you understand what it is, what evaluations they're actually going to be doing on that student, it shouldn't begin more than 10 days after that. But what happens if a parent doesn't sign for consent? And believe it or not, we do have families that at sometimes don't want to go through this process. But the schools have the responsibility to the student, not to the family, but to that student. So if the student, if the school comes forward and says to the parent, we really think there's something else going on, we really would like to gather some more data and do some evaluations, would you sign for consent? And that parent refuses. Well, within that first 5 days, the school needs to show that they have made attempts to reconnect with that parent, have more conversation around that. Because again, the school has the same rights in this case as the parent does. We need to make sure the focus is on that student. Schools need to be able to show that, yes, they have tried to make contact. And after 15 days, school days, if the parent still hasn't signed consent, technically a school could request that the parent maybe participate in mediation, or could even, in very rare cases, take the parent to a due process hearing. You know, those are very rare. There would certainly be situations where the student was either failing or in danger in certain ways, and it does happen. We have lots of families out there that you know, that they're very scared and very concerned about the special education process. So again, it really keeps the focus back on the student. Now, when we talk about consent, and I just want to, you know, focus a little bit on this, it's important what consent means. And consent means that that parent has been fully informed of all the information. They have a clear understanding of what it is that the school is trying to gather. They also need to understand it's a voluntary process, and that what activity is actually going to be taking place. Sometimes parents sign, they nod their heads, they go ahead and kind of do what they think the school wants them to do, but they don't always have a clear understanding. It's very important that schools make sure that parents do understand that. So in this slide, this is our timelines kind of chart to kind of get a better idea. So within 60 calendar days from the receipt of parental consent, so the child needs to be evaluated. A written report needs to be put together from the evaluation team. And then at that point, either eligibility or non-eligibility has been determined. So already we're talking about 2 months. And that can be a long period of time. Now, sometimes that'll take place a lot sooner than that, but it should not take place more than 60 days. After that, if the child is determined eligible, an IEP needs to be developed within 15 school days. So again, now there's another 3 weeks after we've determined, okay, this child is a child with a disability. They need some kind of special education supports and services. And the school has 3 weeks to sit down with the family and develop that IEP. And then the last piece of that timeline is once that IEP is developed, there is 10 more school days before it's actually implemented. So when you look at this period of time, it really is important for parents to kind of stay ahead, understand what those timelines are, and make sure they happen, because it can be quite a bit of time before that child is getting the support they need. But what happens? Sometimes kids don't qualify for special education. That's not the worst thing in the world. Not every child needs specialized services. But you as a parent need to know what your options are if that does happen. Probably the most important question that we want parents to walk away with to go back and ask the school. So if my child isn't eligible for special education and we've been putting in some interventions all along and he's still not being successful, what other interventions is a school going to put in place? How are you going to help my child be successful? Because if we're shutting this door, I'm assuming that we're not saying this is it, this is all we can do. So it's important to, again, kind of go back very nicely, ask that question. The response may come back around the conversation about response to intervention, or RTI as they call it. And although we're not going to get into a big conversation about RTI, response to intervention is a very important part of the process of gathering data for a student. Now, if things are going well, this information, this response to intervention for many kids should already be taking place. The data that we gather on a daily basis is really important to determine whether, again, this is a child with a disability and what those supports might be. But it shouldn't necessarily be the time to start response to intervention, but it certainly should be part of that conversation. And again, recognizing that there are a lot of people in a school that it can help students. Not all of them have to be special educators in order to be able to support that student. But lastly, a parent can also turn around and say, I disagree with those evaluation results. I don't agree at all. I've got my home data. I may even have outside information from my doctor, but I don't agree, and therefore I'm requesting an independent educational evaluation to be done at the school's expense. Now we'll talk a little bit more about the IEE a little bit later, but at this point in the game, those are the things that we want to be considering. So let's review those timelines really quick. So here's what we've learned. The referral process, 10 days to review, sit down, talk, parents, professionals together, 10 days from written consent to get that evaluation done. Eligibility determination in that process can take up to 60 days, no later. If that child's eligible, should be another 15 school days to develop that IEP. And lastly, once that IEP is developed, it should be another 10 days, no longer than 10 days before it's actually implemented. So that's, again, just kind of summing up what we've just talked about. Next, we're going to move into having more of a conversation about the evaluation process.